Picture this. September 1971, the foggy streets of London echo with whispers of an impossible crime. The most secure bank vault in Britain has been breached without a single alarm going off, without a trace of forced entry, and without anyone even knowing until it was too late. But here's the shocking twist that left everyone stunned. The criminals left behind a message that would make your blood run cold. Welcome to the most audacious bank heist in British history, where reality became stranger than fiction, and where criminals dared to challenge the greatest detective mind ever created. I'm about to take you on a journey through cobblestone streets and shadowy alleyways, where professional thieves executed a plan so masterful that it seemed ripped straight from the pages of a Sherlock Holmes novel. But wait, there's something even more incredible. This crime didn't just happen anywhere in London. It happened on Baker Street itself, the very same street where the world's most famous fictional detective supposedly lived at 221B. And the message those criminals left behind? It was a direct taunt to Sherlock Holmes himself, daring him to solve what they believed was the perfect crime. What you're about to discover will shock you. How did they do it? How did they tunnel underneath one of London's busiest streets without being detected? How did they know exactly when to strike? And most importantly, what was that spine-chilling message that left investigators and the public completely speechless? This isn't just a story about a bank robbery. This is a tale of meticulous planning, incredible audacity, and a twist of fate involving a ham radio operator who accidentally stumbled upon the crime of the century. You'll discover how real life mirrored fiction in the most extraordinary way, and how the criminals' own arrogance ultimately led to their downfall. Don't go anywhere, because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you think you know about the perfect crime. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because you won't want to miss a single detail of this incredible true story that reads like the greatest detective novel ever written. Let me paint you a picture of London in September 1971. The swinging 60s had given way to a more conservative era, but beneath the surface of respectable British society, something extraordinary was brewing. At 185 Baker Street stood Lloyd's Bank. Not just any ordinary bank, but one of the most secure financial institutions in the entire country. This wasn't your typical neighborhood bank with a simple safe in the back room. Lloyd's Bank boasted state-of-the-art vault technology that was considered virtually impenetrable. Multiple layers of security protected hundreds of safety deposit boxes containing the most valuable possessions of London's elite. Jewelry worth fortunes, important documents, cash reserves, and items so precious their owners trusted no other location to keep them safe. The vault itself was a marvel of engineering for its time. Thick steel walls, sophisticated locking mechanisms, and security protocols that had been refined over decades of banking expertise. The very thought of breaking into such a fortress seemed absurd to anyone with even basic knowledge of bank security. Yet somewhere in the shadows of London, a group of professional criminals was already plotting the impossible. But who were these masterminds? They weren't common street thugs or desperate amateurs. These were seasoned professionals who understood that the greatest heist in history would require the patience of monks and the precision of Swiss watchmakers. They had studied their target for months, noting every detail, every routine, every possible weakness in what appeared to be an impenetrable fortress. The leader of this criminal enterprise possessed a mind that could rival any detective fiction character. He understood that conventional methods would never work against such sophisticated security. Breaking down the front door was out of the question. Disabling alarms would trigger backup systems. Even attempting to bribe guards would be too risky in such a high-security environment. So they conceived something that had never been attempted before in British criminal history. They would go underground. Literally. They would tunnel their way to the treasure, bypassing every security measure by approaching from an angle no security expert had ever seriously considered. But even this audacious plan required the perfect cover story. Enter Lysac, a modest leather goods shop located just 2 doors down from the target bank. To casual observers, it appeared to be nothing more than another small business trying to make its way in London's competitive retail landscape. The shop sold handbags, briefcases, and other leather accessories, perfectly legitimate merchandise for perfectly legitimate customers. But beneath this innocent facade, something far more sinister was taking shape. The criminals had rented this shop not to sell leather goods, but to provide the perfect cover for the most ambitious underground operation in criminal history. From the basement of Lysac, They would begin their journey into the depths of London's foundation, carving a path through earth and stone toward their ultimate prize. The genius of this plan lay not just in its audacity, but in its attention to detail. They understood that their excavation work would create noise, the kind of noise that would draw unwanted attention in the middle of a busy London business district. So they planned their operations exclusively for weekends, when the surrounding offices would be empty and foot traffic would be minimal. Between Lissac and Lloyd's bank stood another business, the Chicken Inn restaurant. This meant the criminals would have to tunnel not just under the street, but under an active restaurant where customers dined unaware that beneath their feet, the crime of the century was slowly taking shape. The technical challenges were enormous. They needed proper ventilation to prevent suffocation in their underground workspace. They required lighting systems that wouldn't be detected from above. Most critically, they needed tools capable of breaking through whatever obstacles they might encounter. Concrete foundations, water pipes, electrical systems, or structural supports that could collapse and bury them alive. Week after week, they labored in darkness and cramped conditions, moving earth one handful at a time, disposing of excavated material without arousing suspicion. Each weekend brought them closer to their target, but also closer to potential discovery. One misplaced tool, one unusual noise at the wrong time, one curious passerby asking too many questions could destroy months of meticulous preparation. As autumn progressed and their tunnel neared completion, they faced their greatest technical challenge yet, actually breaching the vault itself. Their initial plan involved using a thermal lance, a cutting tool that could slice through even the thickest steel. But when they finally reached the vault wall, they discovered that even their sophisticated equipment wasn't enough to complete the job. This is where desperation met determination. Rather than abandon their elaborate scheme, they made a decision that would echo through criminal history. They would use explosives to finish what the thermal lance had started. The moment of truth had arrived. After months of painstaking excavation work, the criminals found themselves face to face with the final barrier between them and the greatest treasure trove in London. The vault wall of Lloyd's bank stood before them like the last guardian of an ancient tomb, thick steel that had been designed to withstand any conventional attack. Their thermal lance had made progress, but not enough. The cutting tool that they had counted on to slice through the vault's defenses had met its match in the bank's sophisticated security infrastructure. Lesser criminals might have given up at this point, but these weren't lesser criminals. They were professionals who had invested too much time, too much planning, and taken too many risks to walk away empty-handed. The decision to use explosives was not made lightly. They understood that detonating charges so close to occupied buildings carried enormous risks. Too much explosive force could bring down portions of the surrounding structures, potentially injuring innocent people and certainly drawing immediate attention from authorities. Too little force would leave them still trapped outside the vault, having revealed their presence without achieving their goal. They calculated the precise amount of explosive needed to breach the vault wall without causing catastrophic damage to the buildings above. This required not just criminal expertise, but genuine technical knowledge that spoke to the sophisticated nature of their operation. These weren't desperate thieves grabbing whatever they could find. They were executing a plan that rivaled military operations in its complexity and precision. The explosion, when it came, was carefully timed and expertly controlled. In the confined space of their tunnel, the blast was deafening, but to the world above, it registered as nothing more than a distant rumble that could have been construction work, a heavy truck backfiring, or any of the countless noises that make up the soundtrack of urban life. When the smoke cleared and their ears stopped ringing, they saw what they had worked so long to achieve, a hole in the vault wall large enough for a person to crawl through. Beyond that opening lay hundreds of safety deposit boxes, each one potentially containing treasures worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. But their troubles were far from over. They now faced the delicate task of opening individual safety deposit boxes without triggering additional security measures. Each box had its own locking mechanism, and they couldn't know which ones contained valuable items and which might hold nothing more than old documents or sentimental keepsakes. Working by flashlight in the cramped confines of the vault, they began their systematic looting. Cash was the priority. It was untraceable and immediately useful. Jewelry came next, pieces that could be easily transported and eventually sold through criminal networks. Important documents were also valuable, not for themselves, but for the potential blackmail opportunities they might provide. As they worked, they discovered treasures that exceeded even their ambitious expectations. The safety deposit boxes contained not just money and conventional valuables, but items that spoke to the secret lives of London's elite. Compromising photographs, sensitive documents, and personal effects that their owners had trusted to the bank's security became part of the criminals' unprecedented haul. Hours passed as they systematically emptied box after box. The physical demands of the job were enormous, crawling back and forth through their tunnel, carrying heavy bags of loot, working in cramped conditions with minimal lighting. But the potential rewards kept them focused on their task. By the time they finished their work, they had accumulated over $3 million worth of cash and valuables, an astronomical sum that made this the largest bank robbery in British history up to that point. In today's money, that figure would represent tens of millions of pounds, a treasure trove that would set them up for life if they could avoid capture. But perhaps the most extraordinary moment came not during the robbery itself, but in its final minutes. As the criminals prepared to make their escape through the tunnel that had taken months to create, one of them paused to do something that would become legendary in criminal folklore. Taking out a piece of chalk or a marker, he approached one of the vault walls and began to write. The message he left behind would shock investigators, amuse the public, and create a connection between this real-life crime and the world of fiction that no one could have predicted. The words he scrawled on that vault wall were simple, but their implications were profound. Let's see how Sherlock Holmes solves this one. In that single sentence, he had transformed a criminal act into a literary challenge, thrown down a gauntlet to the most famous detective in the world, and created a connection between reality and fiction that would capture imaginations for decades to come. With their taunting message complete and their bags heavy with stolen treasure, the criminals began their retreat through the dark tunnel that would either lead them to freedom or become their tomb. What the criminals didn't know as they crawled through their tunnel with bags of stolen treasure was that their perfect crime had been anything but perfect. Miles away from Baker Street, in a modest flat on Wimpole Street, Robert Rowlands was about to become an unwitting hero in one of the most extraordinary coincidences in criminal history. Rowlands was what people in those days called a ham radio operator, a hobbyist who enjoyed tuning into different radio frequencies, listening to conversations from around the world, and generally exploring the invisible world of radio communications that surrounded London every day. On this particular weekend evening, he was trying to tune into Radio Luxembourg, a popular music station that broadcast from continental Europe. But instead of finding the music he was looking for, Rowland stumbled upon something that would change his life forever. As he adjusted his radio's frequency dial, he began picking up fragments of conversation that seemed distinctly out of place. These weren't the usual radio transmissions he was accustomed to hearing. They sounded like people coordinating some kind of operation. The voices were crisp and clear, suggesting they were coming from somewhere relatively nearby. But what truly caught Rowlands' attention was the professional nature of the communications. These men were using walkie-talkies with military precision, coordinating movements and reporting status updates with the kind of efficiency that suggested serious planning and preparation. As he listened more carefully, the true nature of what he was hearing began to dawn on him. One voice, apparently from inside a building, was reporting progress to another voice that seemed to be positioned as some kind of lookout. They were discussing going down, making progress through the floor, and coordinating timing with someone referred to as the lookout on the roof. The realization hit Rowlands like a thunderbolt. He was listening to a crime in progress. Not just any crime, but something big enough to require multiple people, sophisticated radio equipment, and careful coordination. His first instinct was to contact the authorities immediately, but he also understood that what he was hearing might be difficult for police to believe without evidence. At 11:15 p.m., Rowlands made the phone call that should have prevented the Baker Street bank robbery from becoming the greatest heist in British history. He contacted the local police and explained that he had intercepted radio communications suggesting a major crime was taking place somewhere in central London. But here's where the story takes a frustrating turn that would haunt investigators for years afterward. The initial police response was skeptical, to put it mildly. A civilian calling to report that he had overheard criminal conversations on his ham radio setup sounded like the kind of false alarm that police departments deal with regularly. They suggested that Rowlands record the conversations as evidence before they would take any serious action. This skepticism, while understandable from a law enforcement perspective, would prove to be catastrophically misguided. While police were deciding whether to take the tip seriously, the criminals were making steady progress through their systematic looting of the vault. Every minute of delay meant more empty safety deposit boxes and a larger haul for the thieves. Rowlands, to his credit, persisted in his efforts to alert authorities. He continued monitoring the radio communications and became increasingly convinced that he was witnessing something unprecedented. The professional nature of the criminal coordination, the references to specific technical equipment, and the calm efficiency with which they discussed their progress all pointed to a major criminal operation. Finally, around 1 a.m., Scotland Yard began to take the situation seriously. They dispatched officers and radio detector vans to try to locate the source of the transmissions that Rowlands was intercepting. This represented a significant commitment of resources, suggesting that senior police officials had finally grasped the potential seriousness of the situation. The radio detector vans began sweeping through central London, trying to triangulate the source of the criminal communications. Their sophisticated equipment should have been able to pinpoint the location within a relatively small area, potentially allowing police to arrive on scene while the crime was still in progress. And here's where the story becomes almost too incredible to believe. The police actually located the general area where the transmissions were originating. Their detective work led them to Baker Street itself, putting them within yards of the crime scene while the robbery was still taking place. In what must rank as one of the most frustrating near misses in criminal history, police officers actually checked Lloyd's bank at 185 Baker Street. They walked up to the building, examined the exterior, tested the main doors, and looked for any signs of forced entry or suspicious activity. From their perspective, everything appeared normal. The bank's security doors were intact, there were no obvious signs of break-in attempts, and the building seemed as secure as it should be on a quiet weekend evening. What they couldn't see was that just beneath their feet, the greatest bank robbery in British history was reaching its climax. Imagine being a police officer that night, standing outside Lloyd's Bank on Baker Street, so close to making the arrest of the century that you could practically reach out and touch history. The radio detector vans had done their job perfectly, pinpointing the source of the mysterious transmissions to this exact location. Everything should have fallen into place for a textbook intervention in a major crime. But criminal investigations rarely unfold like they do in detective novels, and this case would prove to be a master class in how the smallest oversights can have the largest consequences. The officers who responded to Robert Rowlands's tip were professional, experienced, and following proper procedures. They had no reason to suspect that the bank they were examining was being robbed from underneath. The criminals' tunnel approach had achieved exactly what they had hoped for. It rendered conventional security measures completely irrelevant. All of the bank's sophisticated alarm systems were designed to detect entry through doors, windows, or walls. None of them were monitoring for someone tunneling up through the floor. The vault's steel walls and electronic locks were useless against an attack that bypassed them entirely. From the police officer's perspective, their inspection of the bank appeared thorough and professional. They checked the main entrance, examined windows for signs of forced entry, tested door handles to ensure locks were secure, and looked for any evidence of suspicious activity around the building's perimeter. Everything they could see from street level suggested that Lloyd's Bank was as secure as it should be on a quiet weekend evening. Meanwhile, just meters below where they stood, the criminals were working frantically to complete their unprecedented heist. The irony was almost theatrical. Law enforcement officers dedicated to preventing crime were literally standing on top of the crime of the century, separated from the perpetrators by nothing more than concrete and earth. The criminals themselves were likely aware that police were in the area. Their rooftop lookout would have seen the patrol cars and radio detector vans moving through the neighborhood. The professional calm that had characterized their radio communications throughout the night must have been tested by the knowledge that discovery was now a very real possibility. But their tunnel provided more than just an unconventional entry route. It also offered complete concealment from conventional police surveillance methods. While officers could detect their radio transmissions, they couldn't see into the underground workspace where the actual crime was taking place. The criminals remained invisible, protected by layers of London's urban infrastructure. What makes this near miss even more remarkable is the timing involved. Police arrived on Baker Street while the criminals were still in the process of looting the vault. Had they thought to bring along acoustic detection equipment, they might have heard the sounds of systematic box breaking echoing up through the building's foundation. Had they examined the interior of the bank instead of just the exterior, they might have noticed subtle signs that something was wrong. But perhaps the most frustrating aspect of this missed opportunity was how close Robert Rowlands came to providing the exact information police needed to make arrests. He continued monitoring the criminal communications throughout the night, providing real-time intelligence about the perpetrator's activities and intentions. In many ways, he was functioning as an inadvertent police surveillance asset, gathering evidence that could have been invaluable for coordinating an effective response. The radio conversations he intercepted revealed details about the criminals' methods, their timeline, and even their personalities. He could hear the stress in their voices as they worked under pressure, the technical discussions about their equipment, and the constant coordination between the vault team and their lookout. All of this information was available to authorities, yet somehow it wasn't enough to prevent the crime. As the night progressed and police failed to locate the actual source of the criminal activity, the perpetrators began to realize that they might actually escape detection. Their confidence grew with each passing hour, and their radio discipline became slightly more relaxed. They began to believe that their impossible plan was actually going to succeed. The criminals' tunnel strategy had created a perfect storm of investigative challenges for law enforcement. Traditional police methods were designed to deal with conventional crimes committed in conventional ways. A bank robbery that approached the target from underground, using sophisticated radio communications and military-style coordination, simply didn't fit the typical criminal profile that officers were trained to recognize. This brings us to our first call to action moment. If you're finding this story as incredible as I am, please take a second to hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think about this missed opportunity. Could modern police have caught these criminals? What would you have done differently? By dawn, the police surveillance operation was winding down without having made any arrests, and the criminals were preparing to make their escape through the same tunnel that had brought them to their target. As investigation details emerged in the following days, something truly extraordinary began to capture public attention. Something that elevated this crime from a simple bank robbery to an almost supernatural coincidence that seemed to blur the lines between fiction and reality. Literary scholars and crime enthusiasts quickly pointed out that the Baker Street bank robbery bore an uncanny resemblance to a Sherlock Holmes story written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle nearly 80 years earlier. The Red-Headed League, published in 1891, featured criminals who tunneled from a nearby shop into a bank vault to commit the perfect robbery. But the similarities went far beyond just the basic tunnel concept. In Conan Doyle's story, the criminals also used a legitimate business as cover for their underground excavation work. They also planned their operation with meticulous attention to detail, understanding that success would depend on avoiding detection during the preparatory phases. Most remarkably, they also believed they could commit the perfect crime by approaching their target in a way that would bypass conventional security measures. The fictional crime in the Red-Headed League was foiled by Sherlock Holmes, who recognized the pattern of unusual activity that preceded the actual robbery attempt. Holmes understood that seemingly innocent business activities could mask sinister preparations, and he positioned himself to intercept the criminals at the crucial moment. Real-life investigators studying the Baker Street case found themselves in the peculiar position of comparing their forensic evidence against a work of fiction. The parallels were so striking that some began to wonder whether the criminals had actually used Conan Doyle's story as a blueprint for their own operation. Consider the location selection process. Both the fictional and real criminals chose targets on prestigious London streets where banks handled the financial affairs of wealthy clients. Both understood that successful tunnel construction would require legitimate access to nearby buildings. Both planned their operations to avoid detection during the lengthy preparation phase that tunneling would require. But perhaps most eerily, both sets of criminals displayed the same kind of intellectual pride that led them to believe they could outsmart the authorities through superior planning and execution. In the fictional case, this pride ultimately led to their downfall when they underestimated Sherlock Holmes. In the real case, the criminals' pride manifested itself in that taunting message they left behind. Let's see how Sherlock Holmes solves this one. This message revealed something crucial about the criminals' mindset. They weren't just stealing money and valuables. They were making a statement about their own capabilities. They saw themselves as intellectual equals to the greatest detective in literary history, and they wanted the world to know that they had succeeded where others would have failed. The Baker Street location made this literary challenge even more pointed. Conan Doyle had placed Sherlock Holmes's fictional residence at 221B Baker Street, making this the most famous address in detective fiction. For real criminals to commit their greatest heist on this same street and then leave behind a message challenging Holmes to solve it created a connection between reality and fiction that captured imaginations worldwide. News media quickly picked up on the literary angle, and headlines began emphasizing the Holmes connection. Real-life criminal challenges, fictional detective, and Baker Street robbery mirrors classic Holmes story became common themes in newspaper coverage. The public found this aspect of the crime almost as fascinating as the technical achievement of the tunnel itself. Literary experts began analyzing the criminal's message for deeper meaning. Was this simply a cocky taunt from successful thieves, or did it represent something more sophisticated? Perhaps a genuine appreciation for detective fiction and an intellectual challenge to the problem-solving methods that Holmes represented. The timing of the challenge was also significant. In 1971, Sherlock Holmes remained one of the most popular fictional characters in the world, with new adaptations appearing regularly in film, television, and radio. The criminals were invoking not just a literary character, but a cultural icon who represented the triumph of logical thinking over criminal cunning. But there was another layer to consider. Holmes' stories had always emphasized that the perfect crime was impossible, because human nature inevitably led criminals to make mistakes that could be detected by sufficiently careful observation. The Baker Street robbers seemed to be claiming that they had transcended this limitation, that they had actually achieved the perfect crime that even Holmes couldn't solve. This intellectual arrogance would prove to be prophetic in ways the criminals couldn't have anticipated. Just as fictional criminals in Holmes' stories were often undone by their own pride, the real Baker Street robbers would discover that leaving behind such a prominent calling card was itself a kind of mistake. The message they thought demonstrated their superiority actually provided investigators with valuable psychological insights into their personalities and motivations. It revealed criminals who saw themselves as intellectuals rather than common thieves, men who took pride in their planning abilities and wanted recognition for their achievements. The morning after the robbery, Lloyd's bank employees arrived at work expecting a typical Monday routine. What they discovered instead was a crime scene that would redefine their understanding of what was possible in the world of professional theft. The vault that had been considered impenetrable now gaped open like a wound, with hundreds of empty safety deposit boxes bearing silent testimony to one of the most audacious crimes in British history. The initial shock of discovery gave way to the grim reality of assessment. Bank officials had to systematically catalog exactly what had been stolen, a process that would take days to complete and reveal the true scope of the criminal's success. Each empty safety deposit box represented not just financial loss, but a violation of the trust that customers had placed in the bank's security systems. Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler, who had built his reputation pursuing major criminals across London, found himself facing a case unlike anything in his considerable experience. Butler was known for his methodical approach to criminal investigations and his ability to think like the criminals he pursued. But the Baker Street robbery presented challenges that tested even his considerable expertise. The crime scene itself told an extraordinary story of planning and execution. The tunnel that the criminals had excavated was not a crude hole in the ground, but a sophisticated underground workspace that demonstrated engineering knowledge and remarkable patience. Investigators could see evidence of careful reinforcement work, proper ventilation planning, and methodical disposal of excavated material. Butler's team began their investigation by trying to understand the criminal methodology. How long had the tunnel construction taken? What kind of tools had been required? How had the perpetrators disposed of tons of excavated earth and rock without attracting attention? Each question led to additional questions, creating a complex web of investigative challenges. The breakthrough in understanding came when investigators traced the tunnel back to its origin point, the leather goods shop called Le Sac that had provided the perfect cover for the underground operation. This discovery revealed the true sophistication of the criminal planning. The perpetrators hadn't just tunneled into a bank. They had created an entire false business identity to support their lengthy preparation phase. Examination of the Le Sac shop revealed additional evidence of the criminals' meticulous attention to detail. They had actually operated the business legitimately during their tunnel construction phase, selling leather goods to unsuspecting customers while secretly excavating beneath their feet. This dual operation required not just criminal expertise, but genuine business management skills. The shop's rental records provided investigators with their first concrete leads. Someone had signed the lease, provided references, and maintained the business throughout the operation. These administrative requirements created a paper trail that careful police work could potentially follow back to the perpetrators. Butler's investigation team began the painstaking process of tracking down every person who had been associated with Lysak. They interviewed the landlord, examined financial records, spoke with neighboring businesses, and tried to reconstruct the day-to-day operations of what had appeared to be a legitimate retail establishment. Meanwhile, the forensic examination of the tunnel itself provided crucial technical evidence. The criminals had left behind tools, equipment, and other physical evidence that could potentially be traced back to specific purchases or suppliers. Each item recovered from the tunnel represented a potential breakthrough in identifying the perpetrators. The radio communications that Robert Rowlands had intercepted became another crucial piece of the investigative puzzle. While police hadn't been able to prevent the crime, the recordings that Rowlands had made provided investigators with actual voices of the criminals. Voice analysis technology in 1971 was primitive compared to modern standards, but skilled investigators could still extract valuable information about the perpetrators' backgrounds, education levels, and regional accents. The scale of the investigation required coordination between multiple police departments and specialist units. Scotland Yard's most experienced detectives worked alongside technical specialists who could analyze the engineering aspects of the tunnel construction. Financial crimes experts focused on tracking the stolen items through London's criminal networks. As the investigation progressed, a clearer picture began to emerge of the type of criminals they were pursuing. These weren't desperate amateurs or opportunistic thieves. The Baker Street robbery had been executed by professionals with extensive criminal experience, sophisticated technical knowledge, and the financial resources to support a months-long preparation phase. The taunting message that the criminals had left behind, "Let's see how Sherlock Holmes solves this one," became both a challenge and a clue for investigators. It revealed criminals who saw their crime as more than just theft. They viewed it as an intellectual achievement worthy of recognition. This psychological insight would prove valuable in understanding their likely next moves and potential vulnerabilities. Butler understood that catching these criminals would require the same level of patience and methodical planning that they had used to execute their crime. The investigation would need to be thorough, systematic, and relentless, qualities that would ultimately prove more powerful than even the most sophisticated criminal planning. As 1972 progressed, Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler's investigation began to yield the kind of detailed intelligence that experienced criminals feared most. The slow, methodical accumulation of evidence that would eventually become impossible to explain away. The Baker Street case was proving that even the most sophisticated criminal operation couldn't eliminate every trace of its existence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. While forensic specialists continued analyzing physical evidence from the tunnel, financial investigators had been quietly tracking unusual activity in London's criminal underground. Large quantities of untraceable cash and valuable jewelry had begun appearing in places where experienced criminals disposed of stolen goods, and the timing coincided perfectly with the Baker Street robbery. Butler's team had developed extensive networks of informants throughout London's criminal community over the years. These sources now became invaluable in tracking items that might have originated from the safety deposit boxes. Professional fences, criminals who specialized in converting stolen goods into cash, began reporting approaches from individuals trying to sell high-end jewelry and other valuables. Each of these reports created new investigative leads. Police could sometimes trace specific pieces back to their original owners, creating direct links between the Baker Street robbery and individuals who were attempting to profit from it. More importantly, these transactions created additional opportunities for criminals to make mistakes that careful investigators could exploit. The rental records from Lysak proved to be the most crucial breakthrough. While the perpetrators had used false names and identities when establishing their cover business, they hadn't been able to eliminate every trace of their real backgrounds. Patient police work eventually identified inconsistencies in their false documentation that pointed toward their genuine identities. One of the most significant discoveries came when investigators realized that several of the names associated with Lysak appeared in other criminal records. These weren't first-time offenders who had somehow executed the perfect crime. They were experienced criminals whose previous activities had brought them to police attention. This discovery transformed the investigation from a search for unknown perpetrators into a focused pursuit of specific individuals. Anthony Gavin emerged as a prime suspect through this methodical investigative process. His criminal background included previous convictions that demonstrated both the technical skills and criminal connections necessary for an operation like the Baker Street robbery. More importantly, investigators began uncovering evidence that placed him in London during the crucial preparation and execution phases of the crime. The investigation revealed that Gavin wasn't working alone. Thomas Stephen Gray and Reginald Samuel Tucker were also identified as key members of the criminal team. Each brought specific expertise that contributed to the operation's success: technical knowledge, criminal contacts, and the kind of patience required for months of tunnel construction. But identifying the suspects was only the first step in building a prosecutable case. Butler's team needed evidence that would convince a jury of their guilt beyond reasonable doubt. This required connecting each individual to specific aspects of the crime through physical evidence, witness testimony, or documented activities. The radio communications that Robert Rowlands had recorded became increasingly important as the investigation progressed. Voice analysis specialists worked to match the recorded conversations with known recordings of the suspect speaking. While this technology was still primitive in the early 1970s, skilled analysts could identify distinctive speech patterns, regional accents, and other vocal characteristics. Meanwhile, the investigation of the tunnel itself continued to yield valuable forensic evidence. Fingerprints recovered from tools and equipment were compared against police records. Hair and fiber samples were analyzed to establish connections between the crime scene and potential suspects. Each piece of evidence added to the growing case against the identified perpetrators. The criminals' attempt to create perfect operational security was undermined by the simple reality that complex operations involving multiple people inevitably create multiple opportunities for mistakes. Every rental agreement, every tool purchase, every disposal of excavated material, and every attempt to convert stolen goods into cash represented a potential investigative breakthrough. Butler's investigation strategy reflected his understanding that professional criminals often defeated themselves through their own success. The scale of the Baker Street robbery meant that the perpetrators couldn't simply disappear after the crime. They had stolen too much to keep hidden, and they had used too many resources during preparation to avoid leaving traces. The pressure of ongoing investigation also began affecting the criminals themselves. Professional thieves understood that successful crimes required not just good execution, but also effective concealment afterward. The longer the investigation continued, the more likely it became that someone would make a mistake that would expose the entire operation. As 1973 began, Butler's team had assembled enough evidence to begin making arrests. The methodical police work that had characterized the entire investigation was about to culminate in the kind of breakthrough that would vindicate Robert Rowlands' original tip and prove that even the most sophisticated criminal operation couldn't evade determined law enforcement indefinitely. The arrests, when they finally came in 1973, were executed with the same methodical precision that had characterized the entire investigation. Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler understood that arresting professional criminals required careful coordination to prevent evidence destruction or witness intimidation. Each suspect was taken into custody simultaneously, preventing them from warning each other or coordinating their defense strategies. Anthony Gavin was arrested at his home in the early morning hours, a timing chosen to maximize the element of surprise and minimize the possibility of resistance. When police searched his residence, they discovered evidence that directly connected him to the Baker Street operation. Tools that matched those found in the tunnel, documentation related to the Lissac business, and financial records that couldn't be explained through legitimate sources. Thomas Stephen Gray's arrest revealed additional evidence of the sophisticated planning that had gone into the robbery. Police discovered maps of the Baker Street area with the tunnel route marked, technical drawings of the bank's layout, and detailed schedules that showed how the criminals had monitored the bank's operations during their preparation phase. These documents demonstrated a level of preparation that went far beyond typical criminal activity. Reginald Samuel Tucker's capture provided the final piece of the operational puzzle. His arrest revealed the criminals' disposal methods for the excavated tunnel material, a logistical challenge that had required its own sophisticated planning. Tucker had been responsible for systematically removing tons of earth and rock from the tunnel construction site without attracting attention, a task that required both criminal expertise and legitimate business connections. The fourth member of the gang was also identified and arrested, completing Butler's successful investigation. The evidence gathered against all four suspects painted a picture of criminal cooperation that had required months of preparation, significant financial investment, and specialized technical knowledge that none of them could have provided individually. During interrogation, the full scope of the criminal operation began to emerge. The perpetrators had spent nearly a year planning and preparing for the Baker Street robbery, studying the bank's security systems, monitoring employee routines, and developing their tunnel construction expertise. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, but a masterpiece of criminal engineering. The interrogations also revealed the psychological motivations behind the criminals' actions. They genuinely believed they had executed the perfect crime and were genuinely surprised to find themselves in custody. The taunting message they had left behind, "Let's see how Sherlock Holmes solves this one," reflected their sincere belief that they had transcended the reach of conventional law enforcement. But perhaps the most shocking revelation that emerged during the investigation was the true contents of some of the safety deposit boxes that had been looted. While much of the stolen material consisted of conventional valuables like cash and jewelry, some boxes had contained items that were far more sensitive and potentially embarrassing to their owners. Rumors began circulating that compromising photographs of members of the royal family, specifically Princess Margaret, had been among the items stolen from the vault. These rumors were never officially confirmed, but they added an additional layer of intrigue to an already extraordinary crime. The possibility that the criminals had inadvertently acquired materials that could embarrass the British royal family elevated the case from a simple robbery to a potential national security issue. The revelation of these sensitive materials raised questions about why certain wealthy and powerful individuals had felt the need to store potentially compromising items in safety deposit boxes rather than destroying them. It suggested that Lloyd's bank had been serving as more than just a secure storage facility. It had been a repository for secrets that their owners couldn't risk keeping anywhere else. This aspect of the case also explained why the investigation and prosecution proceeded with unusual discretion in certain areas. While the basic facts of the robbery were widely reported, specific details about some of the stolen items remained classified or were handled through unofficial channels that kept them out of public view. The criminals found themselves in the peculiar position of having committed a crime that was simultaneously the most celebrated robbery in British history and a potential source of embarrassment for some of the country's most powerful individuals. Their success in penetrating the vault had inadvertently exposed secrets that their victims had assumed would remain hidden forever. As the legal proceedings began, it became clear that the Baker Street robbery had implications that extended far beyond simple criminal justice. The case had revealed vulnerabilities in banking security, exposed the existence of materials that powerful people preferred to keep secret, and demonstrated that even the most sophisticated security systems could be defeated by sufficiently determined criminals. The four men who had executed this extraordinary crime now faced the reality that their intellectual pride and technical achievement would be rewarded with lengthy prison sentences. Their challenge to Sherlock Holmes had ultimately been answered not by a fictional detective, but by real investigators whose patient, methodical work had proven more effective than any fictional deduction. The trial of the Baker Street bank robbers in 1973 became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in recent British history. Public fascination with the case stemmed not just from the audacious nature of the crime, but from the extraordinary techniques that had been used both to execute the robbery and to solve it afterward. Anthony Gavin, Thomas Stephen Gray, Reginald Samuel Tucker, and their fourth accomplice found themselves facing charges that reflected the full scope of their criminal enterprise. Beyond simple theft, they were charged with conspiracy, destruction of property, and various other offenses that acknowledged the sophisticated planning and execution of their operation. The prosecution, led by experienced Crown attorneys, faced the unusual challenge of explaining to a jury exactly how the crime had been committed. The technical aspects of tunnel construction, the radio communication system, and the systematic looting of safety deposit boxes required detailed explanation that went far beyond typical criminal trial testimony. Expert witnesses were called to describe the engineering challenges that the criminals had overcome. Structural engineers explained how difficult it would have been to excavate a tunnel beneath busy London streets without causing structural damage to surrounding buildings. These witnesses helped the jury understand that the defendants weren't common criminals, but individuals with sophisticated technical knowledge who had applied their expertise to criminal purposes. The radio communications evidence proved particularly compelling. Robert Rowlands, the ham radio operator who had first alerted police to the crime in progress, testified about intercepting the criminals' conversations. His recordings were played in court, allowing the jury to hear the actual voices of the defendants coordinating their criminal activities. Voice analysis experts testified about matching the recorded conversations to the defendants' speech patterns. While this technology was still relatively primitive in the early 1970s, it provided additional corroborating evidence that supported the prosecution's case against each individual defendant. The evidence from the Lissac leather goods shop demonstrated the elaborate nature of the criminals' cover operation. Witnesses testified about seemingly legitimate business activities that had provided perfect camouflage for months of underground excavation work. The shop's landlord described tenants who had appeared to be ordinary businessmen, paying their rent on time and maintaining normal commercial operations. But perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when prosecutors presented the taunting message that the criminals had left behind in the vault. Let's see how Sherlock Holmes solves this one. This piece of evidence crystallized the defendants' arrogance and their belief that they had committed the perfect crime. Defense attorneys faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against their clients was overwhelming, ranging from physical forensics to recorded conversations to documented financial transactions. Their best strategy involved arguing for reduced sentences based on the sophisticated nature of the planning and the fact that no one had been physically harmed during the robbery. The defense also attempted to portray their clients as criminal craftsmen whose technical achievement deserved some recognition, even if their methods were illegal. They argued that the months of careful planning, the engineering expertise required for tunnel construction, and the precision of the operation demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that warranted consideration during sentencing. However, the prosecution successfully countered these arguments by emphasizing the violation of trust that the crime represented. Lloyd's Bank customers had relied on the institution's security guarantees when storing their most valuable possessions in safety deposit boxes. The defendants had not just stolen money and jewelry, they had undermined confidence in the entire banking security system. The trial also revealed additional details about the scope of the stolen materials. While some items were conventional valuables that could be easily quantified, others represented irreplaceable personal documents, family heirlooms, and sensitive materials whose true value couldn't be measured in monetary terms. When the verdicts were finally delivered, all 4 defendants were found guilty on multiple charges. The sentences reflected both the seriousness of their crimes and the sophisticated nature of their criminal enterprise. Anthony Gavin received 15 years in prison, while his accomplices received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. The judge's comments during sentencing acknowledged the technical achievement that the crime represented while emphasizing that criminal sophistication could not excuse the violation of law and trust that the defendants had committed. He noted that their challenge to Sherlock Holmes had ultimately been answered by real detectives whose methodical work had proven more effective than any fictional deduction. The conclusion of the Baker Street bank robbery case marked the end of one chapter but the beginning of another that would resonate through British criminal history for decades to come. The impact of this extraordinary crime extended far beyond the immediate consequences for the perpetrators and their victims. Robert Rowlands, the ham radio operator whose tip had nearly prevented the crime, finally received recognition for his civic-minded efforts. Lloyd's Bank awarded him $2,500 as a reward for his assistance to the investigation, though this amount seemed modest compared to the millions that had been stolen. Initially, authorities had even threatened to prosecute Rowlands for listening to unauthorized radio transmissions, a bureaucratic response that highlighted how unprepared the system was for such an unusual case. The bank robbery exposed serious vulnerabilities in what had been considered state-of-the-art security systems. Lloyd's Bank was forced to completely redesign their vault security, incorporating new technologies and procedures specifically designed to detect underground approaches to their facilities. Other financial institutions across Britain followed suit, implementing similar upgrades to prevent copycat crimes. The case also revealed the limitations of police surveillance and emergency response systems in the early 1970s. Despite receiving a tip about a crime in progress, law enforcement had been unable to prevent a robbery that took place over several hours. This led to improvements in police communication systems and protocols for responding to unusual criminal reports. The mysterious contents of some safety deposit boxes continued to generate speculation and rumors for years after the trial. While the existence of compromising photographs involving Princess Margaret was never officially confirmed, the rumors persisted and became part of the case's enduring legend. These rumors highlighted how Britain's elite used banking security systems to protect secrets that went far beyond simple financial assets. The criminals themselves became unlikely folk heroes in certain circles. Their technical achievement, patient planning, and audacious execution captured public imagination in ways that typical bank robberies never did. The fact that they had committed their crime on Baker Street and left behind a message challenging Sherlock Holmes added literary drama that elevated their story above ordinary criminal proceedings. Professional criminals studied the Baker Street case as a masterclass in planning and execution, while law enforcement agencies used it as a training example of sophisticated criminal methodology. Security experts analyzed every aspect of the operation to understand how similar crimes might be prevented in the future. The case also influenced popular culture in unexpected ways. The story was adapted into films, television programs, and books that explored both the criminal achievement and the investigative response. The connection to Sherlock Holmes provided a ready-made dramatic framework that writers and filmmakers found irresistible. Banking security technology advanced significantly in response to the vulnerabilities that the Baker Street robbery had exposed. New detection systems were developed specifically to monitor for underground approaches to secure facilities. Vault construction standards were revised to account for threats that previous designers had never seriously considered. The tunnel that the criminals had excavated was eventually sealed and the area restored, but the legend of their underground route continued to fascinate people who passed by the location on Baker Street. The site became an unofficial landmark in London's criminal history, attracting curious visitors who wanted to see where one of Britain's most audacious crimes had taken place. Years later, some of the stolen items were recovered through ongoing police investigations and criminal informants, but much of the haul was never found. The criminals had apparently disposed of their stolen goods through criminal networks that proved impossible to fully trace, ensuring that their crime continued to pay dividends long after their imprisonment. The Baker Street bank robbery ultimately proved that even the most sophisticated criminal planning couldn't account for every variable in a complex operation. The criminals' own arrogance, expressed through their taunting message to Sherlock Holmes, had revealed psychological insights that helped investigators understand and ultimately capture them. As we reach the climax of this extraordinary tale, there's one final twist that makes the Baker Street bank robbery even more remarkable than you might have imagined. The story doesn't end with the criminals' capture and imprisonment. It continues with revelations that would emerge years later, adding new layers of intrigue to an already incredible case. In the decades following the robbery, investigative journalists and criminal historians began uncovering additional details about the case that had been suppressed or overlooked during the original investigation. Some of these revelations suggested that the full story of the Baker Street robbery was even more complex and controversial than the public had been told. New evidence emerged, suggesting that some of the safety deposit boxes had contained materials that were so sensitive they had triggered government intervention at the highest levels. While the rumors about compromising photographs of Princess Margaret had circulated since the trial, later investigations suggested that the stolen materials might have included evidence of official corruption, illegal surveillance activities, and other government secrets that powerful individuals desperately wanted to keep hidden. This led to speculation that the unusual discretion shown by certain aspects of the investigation and prosecution might have been influenced by pressure from sources far more powerful than Lloyd's bank. The possibility that government officials had intervened to prevent certain evidence from becoming public added a political dimension to what had appeared to be a straightforward criminal case. Some investigators began to wonder whether the criminals had known more about the contents of specific safety deposit boxes than they had ever admitted. The sophisticated planning and precise execution of their operation suggested a level of intelligence gathering that went beyond simple criminal reconnaissance. Had they received inside information about which boxes contained the most valuable or sensitive materials? These questions were never definitively answered, but they added to the enduring mystique of the Baker Street robbery. The case had already captured public imagination through its technical audacity and literary connections, but the possibility of government secrets and high-level cover-ups elevated it to the status of a genuine conspiracy theory. The criminals themselves, after serving their sentences, largely disappeared from public view. Unlike many famous criminals who sought publicity after their release, the Baker Street robbers seemed to understand that their continued anonymity was their best protection against further legal complications or criminal retaliation. Anthony Gavin, the apparent leader of the group, never gave extensive public interviews about his role in the robbery. This silence only added to the mystery surrounding the case and fueled continued speculation about aspects of the crime that had never been fully revealed. Professional criminals understood that talking about successful operations could lead to additional prosecution for other unsolved crimes. The technical innovations that the criminals had pioneered during their tunnel construction were studied by both law enforcement and other criminals for years afterward. The Baker Street robbery had demonstrated that even the most sophisticated security systems could be defeated by sufficiently determined and patient adversaries who approached their targets from unexpected directions. Modern security experts continue to study the case as an example of how criminal innovation can outpace defensive measures. The criminals' use of radio communications, their sophisticated cover operation through the leather goods shop, and their methodical approach to vault penetration established new standards for what law enforcement agencies needed to prepare for. The message that the criminals left behind, "Let's see how Sherlock Holmes solves this one," proved to be prophetic in ways they never intended. While the fictional detective never solved their case, real investigators eventually brought them to justice through the same kind of patient, methodical work that characterized Holmes's best fictional achievements. The irony was perfect. Criminals who believed they had transcended the reach of conventional law enforcement were ultimately defeated by the very qualities that made Sherlock Holmes such an effective fictional detective. Careful observation, logical deduction, and relentless pursuit of evidence proved more powerful than even the most sophisticated criminal planning. Today, the Baker Street bank robbery stands as one of the most remarkable criminal cases in British history. It combined technical innovation, literary drama, and investigative excellence in ways that continue to fascinate people more than 50 years after the crime was committed. The story serves as a reminder that truth can indeed be stranger than fiction, and that reality sometimes produces events that are more extraordinary than anything a novelist could invent. The criminals who challenged Sherlock Holmes to solve their perfect crime discovered that real detectives, working with patience and dedication, could be just as effective as any fictional investigator. Before we wrap up this incredible journey, I want you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this don't come around every day, and you won't want to miss the next mind-blowing case I've got planned for you. And there you have it, the most audacious bank heist in British history, a crime so extraordinary that it seemed ripped straight from the pages of a Sherlock Holmes novel, happening on the very street where the great detective supposedly lived. What started as an impossible crime became an unforgettable story of human ambition, technical brilliance, and ultimate justice. 4 professional criminals spent months planning and executing what they believed was the perfect heist, tunneling beneath one of London's busiest streets to penetrate a vault that was supposed to be impenetrable. Their technical achievement was undeniable. They had overcome engineering challenges that would have defeated most people, maintained operational security for months, and successfully extracted over $3 million in cash and valuables from hundreds of safety deposit boxes. Their planning was meticulous, their execution was flawless, and their escape seemed complete. But their greatest strength ultimately became their greatest weakness. The intellectual pride that drove them to attempt such an ambitious crime also led them to leave behind that taunting message, "Let's see how Sherlock Holmes solves this one." In challenging the world's most famous fictional detective, they revealed the arrogance that would help real investigators understand and ultimately capture them. The case proved that while criminals might innovate and plan with incredible sophistication, patient police work and methodical investigation could eventually overcome even the most elaborate criminal schemes. Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler and his team demonstrated that real detective work, while less dramatic than fictional investigations, could be just as effective in bringing criminals to justice. Robert Rowlands, the ham radio operator who nearly prevented the crime through his accidental interception of the criminals' communications, became an unlikely hero whose civic-mindedness deserved more recognition than he initially received. His story reminds us that ordinary citizens can play crucial roles in extraordinary criminal cases. The Baker Street bank robbery entered criminal folklore not just because of its technical achievement, but because of its perfect blend of reality and fiction, professional criminality and literary drama. The fact that this real-life crime mirrored a Sherlock Holmes story, happened on Baker Street itself, and concluded with the criminal's challenge to the fictional detective created a narrative that captured imaginations worldwide. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Could modern security systems have prevented this incredible heist? And don't forget to subscribe because I've got more incredible true crime stories that will absolutely blow your mind. Until next time, keep questioning everything you think you know about the perfect crime.